We're going to turn our attention to the country just south of the United States, Mexico, which just had a momentous election for judges there. I believe the first time in history, but if I'm wrong about that, our next guest will correct me. We are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show by Kurt Hackbarth, who's a writer and journalist for Jacobin Magazine and host of the Soberanía, the Mexican Politics podcast. Kurt, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks very much, guys. Remember the last time I was on, I was in a dark kitchen that I just moved. So things are a little bit more established and in order this time.
Good. I like that. I appreciate that. If we had a little more time, I'd ask you to give us a little tour, of what your new place is looking like.
Well, it's nice. It's downtown Mexico City. It's one of those old buildings from the 50s when they made apartments that were actually big enough to live in, right?
Oof.
Not anymore.
Amazing. Well, Kurt, we just had the election, the judicial election. I think the last time we had you on, that was one of the topics we were discussing. It's a major issue for Mexico. Give us a sense of the outcome. I made the mistake of going to Politico Mexico to look for the results. And of course, they were spending the whole night saying how it was a total failure. But that doesn't really seem like the case. I heard you and Alina Duarte talking about this a little bit the other day. But how did it go? And what are some of the initial reactions flowing from it?
Yeah, so actually, just briefly, I'm now on a program in Mexico's public broadcaster, Canal Once with Alina. So we're having a great time over there, a show called Sin Muros or Without Walls. So anyways, that's something new since last we talked. So yeah, as you can imagine, I'm not in agreement with Politico or The Economist or the New York Times or as to any of the U.S. media that have tried to cast all kinds of aspersions on Mexico's judicial elections. I actually think it was a resounding success. Mexico came out peacefully with great civic spirit on Sunday to elect an entire new Supreme Court and 880 judges and magistrates. So that includes federal magistrates, federal judges at the district and circuit level. It includes the electoral tribunal, and it also includes a new disciplinary tribunal that will have teeth to be able to sanction and even remove corrupt judges. People turned out, and the results are still being tabulated. But I think what we see here, and I think we talked about this last time, Eugene, the fear of a good example. Mexico, López Obrador, before he left office, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, laid out a series of constitutional reforms in February and said, please give us a supermajority in Congress so that we can pass these constitutional reforms. And there were two of them amongst the 20 that were very pertinent. One of them was to give greater rights and autonomy to indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities. Right? And the other was this judicial reform to open the entire federal judiciary to popular election. So the public said, yeah, we're down for that. And they gave Morena that supermajority in both houses of Congress. So, the new Congress got to work and passed these reforms. So what's great, and this is why I mentioned those two reforms in tandem, who got the most votes in Sunday's election? An indigenous lawyer from Tlaxiaco, Oaxaca, of the Mixtec Nation by the name of Hugo Aguilar Ortiz. And because of the new law, the person who gets the most votes will become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that we are now in Mexico going to have an indigenous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from Oaxaca, the most indigenous, southern indigenous state in the country, who spent years compiling a catalog of all of the different what are called usos y costumbres or local mechanisms of democracy of the 417 recognized indigenous communities, pueblos in Oaxaca. Remember, Mexico in general has some 68 indigenous nations, with their own languages, with their own variants of languages. It's a very ethnically and linguistically diverse country. So it's an extraordinary result in the sense that Hugo Aguilar is now going to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And this is what happens when you open the judiciary to popular election. People mobilized, people got out.
Well, Kurt, I want to ask you, amidst all of this, of course, right-wing parties and elite media outlets have tried to paint these elections as dangerous or illegitimate in some way. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the tactics that they have been using to try to undermine this process, and if that's been effective in any way at all.
Well, the tactics have been to basically say this is a power grab. This is part of Morena's, authoritarian autocracy. Kind of, we don't know what stage we are in Morena's dictatorship, because apparently we were a dictatorship before, but now one of the commentators said that we're in a germinal state of, dictatorship. So they're kind of narrating the story out of order, like an avant-garde movie. We don't know at what stage of autocracy we're in. It's a strange argument to contend that voting is dictatorial or that voting is autocratic, but this is the argument they're attempting to make. And with the worst kinds of racism and classism. I mean, just look at the tweets by Mexico's established elites when they realized that an indigenous lawyer is going to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I mean, just the worst kinds of, just this darkest side comes out, right? And this idea that indigenous communities were simply told who to vote for, and they lined up and voted for them because, indigenous peoples don't have any agency or autonomy, right? I mean, it's just the worst kind of stuff. It really, that in itself tells you why such a reform was needed in the first place, to wrest power away from such a corrupt and very racist elite. And so the other big tactic on the part of those who opposed the judicial reform was to boycott it. They said, all right, we're not going to participate. And this is a tactic they've tried before. In Mexico's first initiative and referendum, which was a few years back on trying ex-presidents who may have been involved in crimes, they boycotted that. Then when López Obrador, fulfilling a campaign promise to hold a recall election midway through his term, because a 6 year is a long term, he said, I'll hold a recall election voluntarily halfway through my term. If you want to vote me out, vote me out. They said, no, we don't like that. We're going to boycott that as well. So now they decided to boycott the judicial elections in an attempt to undermine it by saying, well, there's low turnout. Well, the turnout was low because the opposition stayed home. Dumbly, because that means that, progressive judges swept the results. They could have done a lot better had they actually turned out, but they decided not to. So, not the smartest of tactics and strategy there. So this is the way they've tried to undermine the whole thing, by saying there was a low turnout, by saying it's just a power grab. I see it as very different. I see it as making judges beholden to the electors. Remember that Morena is a very popular party. López Obrador won by a landslide. Claudia Sheinbaum won by a landslide. It's very likely Morena will win again in the next round. So, Morena very easily could have, nominated most of the judges themselves over the course of the years. They decided not to do that, and instead they opened it up to popular election. So, I think what you see is Mexico's opposition backing themselves into a corner, or you're heading down a dead end where anything they don't like or anything they think they're not going to win, they're just kind of taking their bat and ball and going home and saying, we're not going to participate. Does that mean they're not going to participate in the upcoming legislative elections? Do they not want to participate in the presidential elections anymore? Is this going to become a routine for them now? Where is the Mexican opposition headed, in tandem with international media? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a great question. I mean, they seem to be, ushering themselves out of the pages of history with this sort of extreme obstructionism. And I feel like, just maybe even from a historical perspective, this has so often been the case, Kurt, that Mexico, when it enters a period of great reform, is deeply demonized in the United States as, some sort of terrible, evil dictatorship. But that's so much, I think, of what this fourth transformation concept is really all about, is moving the country forward in yet another, many countries, I guess you could say this about, but I feel like Mexico has these very distinct periods, of significant reform that have transformed the country, that have established certain basic rights, certain foundations for things moving forward, that this really is a sign, as you've been saying throughout this entire interview, that this is a real transformation. Things are really changing in Mexico.
Well, yeah. And, I think this is an important, point to reflect on also for the US left and the global North left and other lefts, right? There's a big difference between taking office and taking power. So you can win an election and take office, And then you can just sit on your hands and make excuses for not fundamentally changing structures. We've seen it in the US over and over because of the parliamentarian, because of this, because of that, right? Biden presented his own weak and kind of diluted form, which is very similar to Mexico's judicial reform, but it didn't go anywhere, right? Morena is very different in the fact that you have to understand that if you actually want to carry out a transformation, you have to go out take on entrenched power structures. You have to take them on. You can't just make excuses that, oh, well, the judges are overruling everything on technicalities, or they're releasing criminals on Saturdays, or half of the judicial branch is made up of nepotism, is made up of family members of the judges, or they pay themselves stratospheric salaries of $30,000 a month, including benefits. Oh, well, that's just the way it is. Well, no, that isn't the way it has to be, And I think what really burns the Mexican opposition is that Morena has carried this out by the established mechanisms of the Constitution. They went out and said, we want a 2/3 majority to be able to change this. And the public said, all right. And it's interesting that, people talk about low turnout, and, it was a complicated election. You would get between 6 and sometimes up to 10 or 11 different ballots. And, you have to, for example, for the Supreme Court, you have to choose 5 women from a list and 4 men from a list because there's gender parity. And then for the other different ballots, you might have to choose 3 people or 2, or, it's not easy. It's not easy. So, people really were, it was really fun to watch over the days and weeks before the election of people making their lists and compiling their lists and consulting with friends and consulting with people that they trusted, because these were nonpartisan elections. Parties could not endorse specific judges. And, there wasn't, they couldn't, fundraise from millionaires to have these costly, very expensive campaigns. So it was very much a word of mouth campaign on social media, on interviews. And it was really interesting to watch, this opaque judicial branch where people usually have no idea who are the judges that are really deciding on important things like mining issues and energy issues and environmental issues and water issues. All of a sudden, these names were coming out. People saying, what have they ruled on before? Where have they been before? Who is this person, right? And, it was a very interesting civic exercise. So, that part of it was interesting to watch. I was out at the polls on Sunday watching people vote. They were excited for it. And a poll on the eve of the election, held by the El País newspaper and ENCO, which are hardly friends of Morena, showed that 71% of Mexicans believe that the judicial elections are necessary. Necessarily mean they're all going to come out on a Sunday and fill out 9 ballots, but they understood the necessity of it. And that was a majority not only of Morena voters, but of opposition parties and of independents, because people in Mexico have lived this. This is lived experience. And whatever propaganda is coming from international media, you can't contradict lived experience. People know exactly what it's like to have to pay a bribe to a judge, or exactly what it's like to have a ruling that goes against them because somebody else paid a larger bribe, or because a multinational corporation swooped in and had judges in their pocket. People know exactly what that experience is like. And so, you can't go against lived experience. So, I think that was the important takeaway from Sunday. And I think one more thing on this, first of all, 40 states in the United States elect judges in whole or part. So let the hypocrisy flow from US media. I think in a generation, we'll see the step that Mexico took as a vanguard process where electing judges will be seen as obvious as votes for women or for young people or all of the other steps we had to go to expand the franchise over the years, right? And it took Mexico to do it because the United States is clearly in no shape to be doing it right now.
That's for sure. Going backwards from a judicial perspective. Well, Kurt, as always, it's an honor to have you here helping us sort through it all. Kurt Hackbarth, writer and journalist, thanks so much for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thanks, Eugene. Thanks, Rania.